There is a road outside the Norman town of Livarot, and on the afternoon of July 17, 1944, a black Mercedes staff car was moving fast along it, the driver trying to reach the cover of a side road before the Spitfires that had been tracking them for the past several minutes could make another pass. They did not make it. The aircraft came in low, and the strafing burst caught the car directly, and Germany's most celebrated soldier was thrown from the vehicle at speed, his skull fractured in multiple places. He was 69 days from what would have been the most consequential military and moral act of his life. He was 3 days from the moment that act was supposed to happen. 3 days later, a briefcase sat beneath a heavy oak conference table at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, and inside it was a bomb. The man who had placed it there, Klaus von Stauffenberg, a colonel who had lost an eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers of his left to an Allied airstrike in Tunisia, left the room before it detonated. Hitler survived. The July 20 plot collapsed with a speed that suggested it had always been more fragile than its architects believed. By midnight, the ringleaders were dead or under arrest. By dawn, the Gestapo was moving through every address in Germany it had been given, or would eventually extract under conditions that stripped the concept of voluntary disclosure of any meaning. This is not the story of a failed assassination. Those have been told many times, and they tend to focus on the operational failures: the wrong briefcase, the wrong table, the moved conference room, the survived dictator, as though slightly different placement of an explosive would have altered the shape of the 20th century. This is the story of a deeper and more revealing question. What would it have meant for the conspiracy to have had Germany's most famous general not merely sympathetic to it, not merely adjacent to it, but committed to it actively, operationally, irrevocably committed? And what does the answer tell us about the structural limits of what the conspirators were actually capable of achieving, regardless of whether the bomb killed the man it was aimed at? Erwin Rommel was born in November 1891 in Heidenheim an der Brenz, a small market town in Württemberg in the deep southwest of Germany. His father was a schoolteacher who had risen to headmaster-educated, respectable, provincial, and thoroughly removed from the Prussian aristocratic tradition that defined the senior Wehrmacht officer corps. This distinction deserves emphasis, because it shaped not only Rommel's psychology, but his structural position within the military culture he eventually inhabited. The Junker families, who produced men like Ludwig Beck and Henning von Treschkopf and Klaus von Stauffenberg, understood themselves as custodians of a particular military and political tradition, one with roots in Prussian constitutionalism, a sense of honor tied to institutional duty, and a philosophical framework for thinking about the relationship between the state, the military, and the individual conscience that was, however imperfect in its applications, meaningfully distinct from simple obedience. Rommel did not come from that world. He came from a world where distinction was earned rather than inherited, and the instrument of that earning was the one gift his particular constitution offered: an almost instinctual grasp of terrain, momentum, and the psychology of the opponent. He entered the officer cadet school at Danzig in 1910 and was commissioned into the infantry in 1912. The First World War confirmed what his instructors had suspected. At Caporetto in October 1917, as part of a mountain infantry assault that became one of the more remarkable individual operations of the entire war, Rommel led a small force that in roughly 50 hours captured approximately 9,000 Italian prisoners, 10,000 rifles, and over 100 artillery pieces, an achievement accomplished largely through initiative, speed, and his ability to read a collapsing defensive situation and move faster than the enemy could respond. He was awarded the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor, by personal order of the Kaiser. He was 25 years old. What Caporetto established about Rommel, and what would remain essentially consistent across 3 decades, was the nature of his military genius. It was not strategic in the grand sense, it was operational and psychological. He understood the gap between what a defending force expected and what an attacking force could accomplish if it simply moved faster than the expectation. This mattered enormously in France in 1940, and in North Africa, and eventually in his assessment of what would be required to stop the Allied invasion in 1944. It also mattered in a subtler way Rommel's gifts were fundamentally suited to improvisation and tempo, to the fluid battlefield, where command descends from hierarchy to instinct. The kind of conspiracy he was being asked to join in 1943 and 1944 was the opposite of all that: slow, structural, meticulous, built on coordination across multiple command levels, and on the patient tolerance of ambiguity. These were not, by temperament or training, Rommel's native conditions. The interwar years passed predictably: infantry instructor at Dresden, publication of a tactics manual that Hitler read and admired, command of the Führer Headquarters Battalion during the Polish campaign of 1939. Hitler's attention to Rommel in these years was genuine and personal, not the distant admiration a supreme commander might extend to a capable subordinate, but something closer to the enthusiasm of a man who recognized qualities he found instinctively compelling. Hitler had been a corporal in the First World War. He understood, or believed he understood, what made a frontline soldier exceptional, and Rommel's career mapped almost perfectly onto his idealization of soldierly virtue. The common man made extraordinary by will and capability, rather than by birth or appointment. When Rommel was given command of the 7th Panzer Division for the invasion of France in May 1940, over the objections of more senior officers who questioned his armored experience, it was a personal exercise of patronage. The relationship between the two men at that point was not ideological fellowship. It was something more transactional and, on Hitler's side, more sentimental, the great leader elevating the great soldier, each conferring legitimacy on the other. In France, Rommel demonstrated a quality that no objection about his armored experience had anticipated. He drove his division so far and so fast that French, British, and even German headquarters frequently could not locate him on the map. The 7th Panzer became known as the Ghost Division, not initially as a compliment, since its radio silence and unchecked advances created operational confusion in German headquarters alongside Allied ones, but the results were impossible to argue with. He crossed the Meuse, cut off French reserves, reached the English Channel in a matter of days. The campaign made him famous in a way that the Prussian aristocrats in the officer corps found simultaneously impressive and slightly unseemly, and that combination of admiration and resentment would follow him for the rest of his career. North Africa from 1941 to 1943 made him a legend, and this requires careful handling, because the legend was not simply earned, it was constructed, and the construction served purposes that Rommel would eventually find himself unable to detach from. Goebbels's propaganda ministry invested heavily in the Desert Fox as a brand at a moment when the regime needed heroes it could package for domestic and international consumption. The Afrika Korps, consistently outnumbered and undersupplied and fighting at the end of a logistics chain that the Royal Navy progressively strangled, nonetheless managed to push the British 8th Army across Libya and deep into Egypt. And the theatrical quality of that campaign, the open desert, the wide-ranging panzer sweeps, the reversals of fortune lent itself to a kind of war, reporting the ministry exploited with considerable skill. Rommel was not a party member. He held no systematic ideological brief for National Socialism. He was not, as far as the available evidence indicates, aware of the full dimensions of what was being done to Jewish populations in the occupied territories, and the forces under his command in North Africa appear to have conducted themselves without the particular categories of criminality that characterized the Eastern Front campaigns. These distinctions were real. They were also, for the purposes of the Nazi propaganda machine, incidental. What mattered was that Rommel was the right kind of German hero for a regime that needed them. Professionally brilliant, conspicuously brave, non-aristocratic, apparently apolitical, and a detail that should not be dismissed, photographically excellent. The images of him standing in his command vehicle in the desert, squinting at the horizon with the Zeiss field glasses, were reproduced across millions of newsprint pages. The face became the regime's most exportable emblem of military competence. This mattered because it created a specific kind of power that was different from the institutional power of a senior general's rank and command authority. Rommel by 1943 was not merely a general. He was a symbol, and symbols have a quality that ordinary institutional authority lacks: They are simultaneously the property of the institution that created them, and a force that operates outside the institution's control. The propaganda machine had made Rommel so famous, so identified with a certain idea of German martial virtue, that eliminating him, publicly removing him from command, trying him, executing him carried costs that the regime's political managers would have to weigh seriously against whatever he had done to warrant such treatment. This was, in the autumn of 1944, both the thing that saved his family and the thing that sealed his individual fate. But in the spring and summer of 1944, it was also the thing that made him the single most valuable asset the conspiracy could have acquired. El Alamein, in the autumn of 1942, ended the African campaign's momentum. What followed across the next 18 months, the withdrawal under impossible conditions, the evacuation, the reassignment to Italy, and then to France to oversee the Atlantic Wall defenses, traced the arc of a man whose strategic assessment of the war was becoming systematically, and by late 1943 almost terminally, dark. By the spring of 1944, with Army Group B responsible for the defense of the French coast from the Netherlands to the Loire, Rommel had developed an analysis of the military position that was not merely pessimistic but clinically precise. He understood that the Atlantic Wall as constructed was a propaganda architecture rather than a genuine defensive system. He understood that once Allied forces achieved a stable lodgment in France, the Wehrmacht's capacity to dislodge them was constrained by supply, by the near-total Allied air superiority over the Normandy battlefield, and by the progressive degradation of German manpower that 3 years of Eastern Front attrition had produced. And he understood this is the point at which his military analysis began shading into something more politically dangerous, that winning the war in any conventional sense was no longer a realistic objective. The memorandum he sent to Hitler in June 1944, shortly after the Allied landings, was essentially a statement of this understanding in barely veiled terms. He told Hitler that the military situation in France was hopeless and that political decisions were required. A loyal general does not write that sentence. A general who has arrived at a private conclusion about the war's outcome, and who is testing whether that conclusion can be communicated upward without triggering his own destruction, writes exactly that sentence. It was against this background that the approach came, and the question of precisely how that approach was structured, who said what to whom, with what degree of explicitness and what degree of deniability maintained, is one that the historical literature has not fully resolved, and perhaps cannot. Hans Speidel, who had been installed as Rommel's chief of staff at Army Group B in April 1944, was not merely sympathetic to the resistance. He was an active participant in it, maintaining connections to the broader conspiracy through channels that his position as chief of staff made both accessible and somewhat protected. Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, the military commander France, was a committed conspirator who had been involved in resistance planning since at least 1938, and who regarded the July 20 operation as the culmination of years of work toward a specific political objective. Johannes Blaskowitz and other senior commanders in France were variously aware of, sympathetic to, or at minimum not hostile toward what was being planned. These were the men in Rommel's immediate professional environment, and their presence and their conversations with him across the spring and early summer of 1944 constitute the primary evidence for what Rommel knew, and when he knew it. The evidence, read carefully, suggests something more than peripheral awareness. Rommel appears to have understood the general shape of the plan, that an organized group of senior officers and civilian figures intended to remove Hitler and attempt a negotiated end to the war, and that his own name and his command authority were central to the conspiracy's credibility at multiple levels. What he apparently resisted, and this is where the analysis becomes most revealing about both the man and the conspiracy, was the assassination itself. He reportedly expressed to multiple interlocutors a preference for arresting Hitler rather than killing him. This preference has been interpreted variously, as a genuine legal and moral scruple about the sanctioned killing of a head of state, however criminal, as a recognition that a martyred Hitler was more politically dangerous than a living, discredited one, as a calculation about the legitimacy that a post-coup government would need to demonstrate to a German population that had not been prepared for the regime's removal, or as the instinct of a man who needed to preserve a position of plausible distance from the conspiracy's most irrevocable act. Whether it reflected a principled philosophical stand, a pragmatic political calculation, or the psychology of a man who wanted the conspiracy to succeed without fully becoming responsible for it, is something the historical record cannot resolve. What it reveals structurally is that Rommel's engagement was always conditioned on the conspiracy proceeding in a way that left him a position he could morally and publicly defend. This was not a minor caveat, it was a fundamental one, because Stauffenberg's architecture was built around assassination as the necessary trigger for everything that followed, and the conspiracy had no parallel plan for achieving the same effect through arrest. To understand what Rommel's full commitment might have altered, you have to understand what Operation Valkyrie actually was and why it failed as completely as it did. Valkyrie was not, at its core, a plan to kill Hitler. It was a plan to use Hitler's confirmed death as the trigger for the seizure of governmental power by the Reserve Army, the substantial formation of training, replacement, and garrison troops within Germany proper that existed, theoretically, for use in the event of a domestic insurrection or the collapse of internal order. The Reserve Army's commander, Friedrich Fromm, occupied the singular position of a man who was aware of the conspiracy, had declined to join it fully, and had equally declined to report it a posture of deliberate ambiguity that he clearly intended to resolve in whichever direction the events of July 20 suggested was safer. The Valkyrie orders, once transmitted, would mobilize garrison units to seize key communications installations, government buildings, and SS facilities in Berlin and across the major German cities. The mechanism's elegance was that it operated through the legitimate command channels of the Reserve Army itself, the same orders that Valkyrie repurposed had originally been designed for exactly the kind of emergency the conspirators intended to declare. This is significant not because the plan was ingenious, but because it reveals the conspiracy's fundamental dependence on institutional legitimacy at every stage. The conspirators were not revolutionaries in the sense of operating outside the system. They were men who believed that the system's own command structures, if redirected by different hands at the critical moment, could accomplish the governmental change they sought. This meant the conspiracy's viability was inseparable from the question of whether the officers who received Valkyrie orders on July 20 would comply with them, and compliance depended entirely on the conspiracy's ability to project a credible claim to authority in the hours after the bomb went off. When Hitler's survival was confirmed when Keitel at the Oqui transmitted orders contradicting the conspirators' claim that the Führer was dead, that claim dissolved. And it dissolved not because the officers receiving contradictory orders were cowards, but because institutional loyalty in the Wehrmacht's late war culture defaulted toward the clearest surviving source of authority. The conspiracy had staked everything on clarity of outcome. It got ambiguity. Ambiguity was fatal. Rommel controlled Army Group B. He commanded something in the range of 500,000 men deployed across France and the Low Countries at the moment of the Allied breakout and the Wehrmacht's most desperate defensive crisis of the Western War. If he had been not merely sympathetically adjacent to the conspiracy, but actively integrated into its command structure, if his name had appeared on the orders transmitted on July 20, if the commanders of Wehrmacht units in France had received direction from Rommel personally to stand down from loyalty to the Hitler regime and recognize a provisional governmental authority, the question of what would have happened in France on the evening of July 20 and the days immediately following becomes genuinely interesting rather than merely speculative. Von Stülpnagel, acting on the Valkyrie orders as transmitted to Paris, had the SS and SD leadership there arrested in the hours after the detonation. For a brief and remarkable window, it was a demonstration of what determined military command could accomplish within the existing institutional framework. But without confirmed information that Hitler was dead without the signal the entire mechanism required, Stülpnagel's position became politically untenable within hours. When Himmler's communications made clear that Hitler was alive, and when Keitel's transmissions confirmed the Führer's survival and ordered the arrest of Stauffenberg's group, commanders in France faced a binary that resolved itself quickly and badly. The critical difference Rommel's active participation would have created was not merely the weight of his name, though that was substantial, but the command reality that his personal authority would have established in France. A subordinate who disobeys a provisional committee in Berlin, whose authority is contested, is one kind of situation. A subordinate who disobeys orders contradicting the direct instructions of his theater commander, Germany's most decorated serving general, acting publicly and explicitly as part of an organized governmental transition, is a categorically different situation. The conspiracy's collapse in France was not primarily a failure of courage among individual officers. It was a failure of the authority structure on which those officers' compliance depended. Rommel's presence would not have resurrected a plan whose Berlin dimension had already failed. But it might, and the weight that word carries here, is the entire weight of the counterfactual have held the Western theater in a state of operational suspension long enough for events elsewhere to develop differently, or at least created a genuine split in the Wehrmacht's command structure that the regime could not have absorbed as easily as it absorbed what actually happened on July 20. The second branch of the counterfactual is harder to evaluate because it operates at the level of Allied decision-making rather than Wehrmacht command structure, and Allied decision-making in the summer of 1944 was not susceptible to being reshaped by the prestige of German generals. The conspirators, the serious civilian resistance faction that had been building since at least 1938, centered on Karl Gordeler and the former Chief of Staff Ludwig Beck, had been attempting to open back-channel communications with the British government since before the war. Those attempts had uniformly failed, not because the British were uninterested in alternatives to Hitler, but because the strategic logic of the Allied coalition after June 1941 made a negotiated or separate peace in the West politically catastrophic. The unconditional surrender declaration at Casablanca in January 1943 was not merely a diplomatic signal. It was a structural commitment, a constraint on what any post-Hitler German government could realistically expect to receive from the Western Allies, regardless of who led it or how it had come to power. This constraint was documented and consistent. Alan Dulles, the Oststation chief in Bernay, who maintained careful and sustained contact with elements of the German resistance throughout the war, reported back to Washington with considerable regularity that the resistance's persistent hope for a negotiated settlement reflected a misreading of Allied intentions, a misreading that the Americans had no particular incentive to correct. Because the misreading kept the resistance active and created useful intelligence channels. The resistance believed, or permitted themselves to believe, that a post-Hitler Germany with credible conservative leadership and a recognizable military command structure could negotiate terms that preserved meaningful German sovereignty. And this was always the unspoken real objective kept Soviet forces out of Central Europe. This belief was not irrational given certain starting assumptions. But the starting assumptions were wrong. By the summer of 1944, the disposition of post-war Europe was not a Western decision to make unilaterally. Stalin's presence in the coalition was not contingent on what happened at the Wolf's Lair. He had been promised and publicly committed to specific territorial and political outcomes in Eastern Europe. And any separate armistice in the West that implicitly or explicitly excluded the Soviet Union would have constituted a rupture in the Allied coalition that Churchill and Roosevelt were not prepared to risk, whatever their private thoughts about what a Soviet-occupied Central Europe would mean for the post-war order. Rommel's name would have given a provisional government more international credibility than Beck's or Gordeler's alone. It is possible, not certain, but possible that a provisional German government publicly associated with the Western Front's commander might have been offered marginally more favorable armistice terms, or received communications from Eisenhower that bought time for a more orderly transfer of power. But the fundamental architecture of the post-war settlement, unconditional surrender, occupation, denazification, partition, was not Rommel's to negotiate away. The conspirators who placed their hopes in what Rommel's name might unlock with the Allies were not wrong to understand that his prestige was real. They were wrong to believe that prestige, in the summer of 1944 could substitute for the structural reality of unconditional surrender as the only acceptable Allied outcome. The Third Branch cuts closest to the conspiracy's deepest structural failure, and it is the one that no individual general's participation, including Rommel's, could have addressed. By 1944, the SS represented not merely a parallel security apparatus, but an alternative governmental infrastructure that had been deliberately built over 12 years to be structurally independent of the Wehrmacht. Himmler controlled the concentration camps, the Waffen-SS divisions, the police and security apparatus, and through the Reich, the entire intelligence and counterintelligence machinery of the Reich. More importantly, the SS's institutional loyalty was not to the Wehrmacht command structure in any meaningful sense. It was loyalty to the SS itself as an organization, and personal loyalty to Himmler, which was contingent on Himmler's continued ability to deliver protection, advancement, and institutional purpose. In a post-coup scenario where the Wehrmacht was attempting to reconstitute governmental authority in the hours and days after Hitler's death or arrest, the SS was not going to dissolve because Army Group B had issued orders to that effect. The conspirators understood this problem abstractly. Some of them believed, and this belief deserves to be called what it was, namely wishful thinking of a considerably high order that the SS's institutional loyalty could be purchased or redirected if the coup produced a credible governmental successor quickly enough, before the SS had organized a counter-response. This assumed a speed and completeness of execution that Valkyrie, as designed, could not achieve even under the best circumstances, and July 20 was not the best circumstances. Worth noting, too, is that Himmler himself was by the summer of 1944 engaged in his own tentative and deniable back-channel communications with Swedish intermediaries about potential post-war arrangements, a fact that suggests the SS apparatus was not monolithically committed to fighting to the last man in the Nazi cause, but was rather pursuing its own institutional survival logic. That logic, however, was not going to align with a Wehrmacht-led coup. Rommel's command in France could have locked down the Western theater. It could not have locked down the SS organizational structure from the Baltic to the Adriatic. The conspiracy had no answer to that problem, and Rommel's involvement would not have produced one. What came next, in the history that actually occurred, unfolded with the administrative efficiency the regime had perfected for managing its own internal crises. Thousands were arrested in the weeks following July 20. Treschkow, who had been the conscience of the conspiracy's Eastern Front dimension and who had understood with complete clarity that the attempt might fail, walked into no man's land near his headquarters and detonated a grenade rather than allow himself to be taken. Stauffenberg and 3 others were shot in the courtyard of the Bendler block in the early hours of July 20. From, having arrested them, apparently calculating that their swift execution would obscure his own documented prior knowledge. The calculation failed. He was eventually executed in March 1945. Gordeler was captured in early August, held, tortured, and hanged in February 1945. More than 200 people connected to the conspiracy were eventually executed, many of them after show trials before Roland Freisler in the People's Court, who shrieked at the defendants with a theatrical contempt that even some Nazi officials found excessive. And Freisler himself was killed in February 1945 when an American bomb struck the courthouse during a session, an irony the historical record deposits without comment. Speidel was arrested in September 1944. He survived improbably, because the evidence against him never became fully conclusive, and because Rommel, in the weeks before his own death, apparently refused to confirm Speidel's operational involvement even under the considerable pressure of his situation. This detail should not pass unexamined. A man protecting his chief of staff while facing his own death is performing a kind of loyalty that the regime's interrogators had not expected and could not easily extract through the methods available to them. It was perhaps the clearest act of genuine moral agency in Rommel's final months, not the ambiguous sympathy toward the conspirators during the spring, not the carefully worded memorandum to Hitler, but the refusal, under conditions where refusal carried real cost, to give a name. Rommel's own end came at the pace of a man being methodically maneuvered into a corner that had been prepared well in advance. He was recovering at his home in Herrlingen when the Gestapo began assembling the testimony that would place him in the conspiracy's organizational orbit. Von Stülpnagel, blinded in his suicide attempt on the road to Berlin, apparently named Rommel in his delirium. Others, under conditions that excluded anything resembling voluntary disclosure, confirmed what the Gestapo had already suspected, that Rommel had been aware, that his name had appeared in discussions about the composition of a provisional government, that Speidel had maintained the organizational channels. The file that reached Hitler was sufficient for a charge. Whether it was sufficient for a public trial was a different question, and the regime's political managers understood the distinction clearly. Rommel was too famous. The state funeral had been too publicly prepared, the propaganda fiction of the Desert Fox too carefully maintained, the risk of a people's court proceeding against Germany's most celebrated soldier too unpredictable in a domestic environment that was fraying at every edge under Allied bombing, military retreat, and the progressive collapse of the institutional coherence that had kept the home front stable. On October 14, 1944, two generals arrived at Herrlingen, Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Meisel, carrying with them the alternative that the regime had determined was the cleanest solution to the problem Rommel represented. Face the People's Court, with near certain execution and the strong probability that his wife and son would be implicated and punished alongside him, or accept a state funeral with full military honors and a guarantee of his family's safety. He was given approximately 20 minutes to make this decision. He said goodbye to his wife and to his 15-year-old son Manfred, telling them what was about to happen. He got into the car. He was dead within 15 minutes, the cyanide administered on a road less than a mile from his home. The funeral was held on October 18, 1944. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt delivered the eulogy. The official cause of death was a brain embolism from wounds sustained in the July 17 strafing attack. The regime maintained the fiction without difficulty, because acknowledging Rommel's involvement in the plot served no purpose the regime's present circumstances required, and because the fiction served a purpose the regime still desperately needed, a German hero who had died for Germany, a symbol of military virtue, whose death could be absorbed into the war's ongoing narrative of sacrifice, rather than standing as a data point in the war's narrative of institutional collapse. This is the detail that the historical record cannot allow to pass without extended examination. The regime received from Rommel's death exactly what it would have received if he had spent his final months in complete and unambiguous loyalty to the Nazi state. The propaganda value of the Desert Fox was preserved. The state funeral produced the intended effect. A man who had known about the plot, who had sheltered his chief of staff's active involvement, who had sent Hitler a memorandum in June 1944 that amounted to a declaration that the war was lost, was buried with full military honors and eulogized as a fallen hero of the Reich. The irony is structural and almost perfectly calibrated, because the conspiracy's central conviction had been that senior Wehrmacht officers possessed the moral authority and institutional position to impose a different future on Germany, while the regime's central conviction was that it could absorb any degree of institutional disloyalty provided the outward performance of loyalty was maintained. Rommel's death demonstrated, with a precision that required no editorial comment, which conviction was correct. None of this should be read as a simple indictment of Rommel's character, although the indictment is easy enough to construct. He was not a resistor who lacked only the physical opportunity. He was also not a loyal servant of the regime who happened to occupy the same air as dissidents. He was something more uncomfortable than either, a man whose gifts and whose ambitions had made him indispensable to a system he had by 1944 clearly come to find intolerable, and who navigated the resulting contradiction in a manner that preserved his options rather than foreclosing them until the system, with its characteristic efficiency, foreclosed them for him. Whether this constituted moral cowardice or moral realism, whether the appropriate standard of judgment is the one held by Treschow, who understood that the conspiracy would very likely fail and concluded that attempting it was what honor required regardless, or the one held by the far larger number of senior officers who never approached the question at all, is a judgment the historical record poses without resolution. Rommel's ambiguity was his choice. even if its consequences were not. What the counterfactual ultimately reveals, and this is perhaps its most unsettling yield, is that the conspiracy's dependence on Rommel's participation was itself a symptom of the conspiracy's structural insufficiency. The resistance needed a figure of his particular kind of fame and command authority precisely because it lacked the broad institutional support that would have made any individual general's name operationally irrelevant. If the Wehrmacht as an institution had been capable of producing the collective political will to end the war, Rommel's involvement would have been significant, but not singular. The fact that it appeared potentially singular, that a single general's active presence might have tipped an otherwise brittle operation toward something workable in the Western theater, describes a resistance movement that was always smaller, more isolated, and more operationally fragile than the moral seriousness of its leading figures would suggest. The courage was entirely real. The structural position was not commensurate with it. There is something in that gap that speaks beyond the particular circumstances of July 1944 and the particular figure of Erwin Rommel. Systems of absolute power do not merely suppress dissent. They shape the conditions under which dissent is possible, and in shaping those conditions, they ensure that the individuals most capable of resistance are precisely those most entangled with the system's own logic, the generals, the senior officials, the men whose access to institutional power was inseparable from their prior complicity in the system's operation. The conspiracy's members were not peripheral figures who had somehow remained clean. They were men who had served, advanced, decorated themselves with the regime's medals, and achieved their positions through the same institutional machinery they were now attempting to dismantle. Rommel, more than almost any of them. And the particular tragedy of his position is not simply that he failed to commit fully and paid the same price as those who did. It is that the system was so constructed that the people best positioned to end it had become, in the process of acquiring that position, precisely what they intended to destroy. The shrapnel on the road outside Livarot did not alter history by preventing one man from attending one meeting. What it did, in the blunt and impersonal way that physical contingency occasionally clarifies what deliberate human action cannot, was expose how completely history had already made its preparations not by chance but by design, through the systematic work of a regime that had spent 12 years ensuring that the men with the institutional power to stop it were the men who had built it, and that the men who understood what had to be done lacked the means to do it, and that those few who possessed both the understanding and the means would spend their last ambiguous months weighing the difference between a gesture toward honor. If you found this video informative, please consider subscribing to the channel.